We're going to be looking at our frequencies. Now, we've seen something like this before. I've talked about frequencies before, but I want to make sure that we know how to work this out. Now, the word frequency basically is the number of times a value in a data occurs. So we have data, we're going to have information, and it might come out multiple times. Now, frequency is how many times does it come up? That's basically what it is. We can kind of relate it to frequent, right? In English, we say frequent times, but then there's also the phrase relative frequency. It's basically a ratio, ratio we talk about as a fraction of the number of times a value of the data occurs in comparison to all the data. Remember, frequency is just how many times. Relative frequency is how many times compared to all the data. We do it as a fraction. So we divide how many times, so the frequency divided by the total amount of times, the total number we have in the data. Now, cumulative relative frequency is the accumulation of the previous relative frequency. So I'm going to be adding, it tends to be close to 1 because we write I'm going to write my frequency in decimals. I'm going to round it to the nearest hundredth. Okay, so hundredth sounds like 100. It's a number with 2 zeros. So I'm going to be rounding my answer to 2 decimal places. When I add my cumulative relative frequency, adds up to close to 1. Because when you think of 1 as a decimal, basically means 100%, right? So it does add up to very close to 100%. Sometimes it might be a little bit off because of my rounding. So here it says complete the frequency tables with the information given. Something about games per World Series. Okay. And then it says games 4, frequency 2. Then it says games 5 and frequency 4. So games per World Series. So there were, how many World Series went to 4 games? 2 of them. How many went to 5 games? 4. 6 games? 3. And then how many World Series went up to 7? 2. According to the data we're looking at, that's what we have. So my gains and my frequency was already filled in for me. Now, relative frequency. So I'm going to say I'm going to add my frequencies here, my numbers here. I'm going to add this column. 2 plus 4 plus 3 plus 2. I'm just going to add these numbers, and it happens to be 11. So my data has 11 World Series. Okay, that's not bad. So my relative frequencies, I'm going to be looking at the first row. Relative frequency, they're 2 times. So I'm going to go 2, because my frequency is 2, divided by 11. Divided by 11 because there's a total of 11 numbers in my data. I'm going to use a calculator. I'm going to round this to the nearest hundredth, so to 2 decimal places. So I'm going to call this 0.18. Okay, now on my second column, let's say on my second row, I see the frequency was 4 out of 11. So I'm going to go 4 divided by 11. I use my calculator, and I round it to 2 decimal places, so my answer is going to be 0.36. When you type in this in, I don't expect you guys to type in the fraction. I'm typing in the fraction, but you don't have to type in the fraction. You just have to type in the decimal, okay? Now, this other one, 3 out of 11. So I'm going to go 3 out of 11. Use a calculator for this, and it gives me 0.27. And then lastly, 2 out of 11 gives me 0.18. Okay, so I saw that relative frequency is how frequent each of my data was compared to all my data. Now, cumulative relative frequency, starting from the first one, I'm just going to copy this frequency 0.18. Now, my next value, this answer 0.18, let me add it to this. So 0.18 plus 0.36 gives me 0.54. If if I look into this as percentage, 54% of my games were either 4 games or 5 games. Oh, I mean, 54% of my World Series went either to 4 games or 5 games. Okay, so I see that. Now for my next one, 0.54 added to 0.27. 0.54 plus 0.27 gives me 0.81. So when I'm looking at this as percentage, 81% of my games went either to 4 games, 5 games, 6 games. Okay. And then on my last space, let me add my 0.81 plus 0.18, and it gives me 0.99. Well, did not get exactly to 1 because of my rounding, right? On my rounding, I got a little bit off. And I said this last value, I just mentioned it a few seconds ago, my last value should be very close to 1. Could be a little bit under 1 or it could be a little bit over 1. It all depends on my rounding. Okay, so now here, notice how on this chart, when I was working it, it had, here it was something about games for World Series. So it had something related to that. And then it had the word frequency, and cumulative relative frequency. Now, those words were there to begin with. But on my next example, look, I have nothing. I have nothing there. So the way I'm going to start with, my first space, it's what does my data do? What's my title of my data? So here it says complete the frequency table with information given, and it says something about shoe size. So my first space here is like, what does this data covered? And I'm going to say, well, it talks about shoe size. Shoe size. Now, one thing, do respect the spelling. If I came over and I capitalized the S from size, so I wanted to use capital letters, when I type this, respect the spelling. So shoe and then size capital. I didn't capitalize the S on size, so don't capital. So if I do come over and then I say World Series and then capitalize a W for world and S for series, because I'm looking at it as a name, then do respect the capital letters. Okay. Now, after that, my second space is going to be about frequency. So let me spell out the word frequency. Like I said, in my first example, everything was given. My second example, everything is not given. The third space here will be relative frequency. Now, am I going to expect you guys to type this in your homework? Of course. And then my last space is cumulative. So I'm spelling this out. Relative frequency. Pardon the spelling, but I'm writing with my fingers. It makes it hard. So then I see some spaces here. I'm like, all right, I want to see the range of my data. I want to see how many possible values can I have. According to my data, first I look for what's the smallest number that I see here. My smallest number seems to be 4. So, and it's gonna go up to, then I'm start looking, okay, what's my biggest number to my data? Here, my biggest number is 11. So I wonder how many numbers are there from 4 to 11? I can easily count them, right? Start counting from 4. I can go 4, 5, 6, all the way to 11. Start counting. The numbers are not that big. Now, I would not want to count if my data was from 4 to 5,000. I would not want to count that. So instead of counting, what I'm going to do, I know that I can easily subtract 11 minus 4, and that gives me 7. However, 11 minus 4 is going to tell me how many numbers after 4 I need to get to 11. 7. So if I started counting at 5, 5, 6, 7, all the way to 11, I'm going to have 7 numbers. But because I want to include 4, so what I'm going to do, I'm going to subtract these values, but because I want to include my first value, I'm going to add 1. My adding 1 is just because I want to include my first value. Right? If I just subtract them, 11 minus 4 is how many values after my 4, after my first digit. But because I want to include it, don't forget to add the 1 at the end. 7 plus 1 is 8. So I need 8 spaces here. And then let me count them. I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8. Good, I have them. I have enough. Now, what if I didn't have enough spaces? What if I only had 4 spaces, but I need 8 numbers? Well, divide your 8 divided by how many spaces you have. In my case, I have 8, so I'm going to put per number here. So I'm going to go 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, and 11. I had enough spaces to go count by ones. But again, what if I didn't have enough space? What if I only had four spaces and I need 8 of them? Well, then I go from 4 to 5. I go by twos. 4 to 5, 6 to 7, 8 to 9. Now my frequency. Okay, so let me put my numbers here. Let me look at my data. And then I'm going to ask myself, how many 4s do you see on the data? I only see 1 of them. Okay, so my frequency is 1. How many 5s do you see on the data? Well, I see none of them, so 0. How many 6s do you see on the data? I only see it once. How many 7s do we see on the data? I see 2 of them. How many 8s? I see 1, 2, 3, 4 of them. How many 9s? I only see 1 of them. How many 10s? I see 1, and I see 111. Let me add these numbers just to make sure I have everything fine. So I'm gonna go 1 plus 1 plus 2 plus 4 plus 1 plus 1 plus 1. I'm supposed to have 11 numbers. My data, and I see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, and 11. Good. I counted them right. Now, if I would have added these and only add to 10, and I'm supposed to have 11 numbers, then I know I miscounted. Okay, good. So now my relative frequency, there's 11 numbers total, so my relative frequency is going to be 1 out of 11. Now, according to my calculator, 1 out of 11 is 0.09. I have to round this to 2 decimal places. My second one, I'm going to go 0 out of 11. Well, 0 out of 11 is 0. Good. On the next one, 1 out of 11. 1 divided by 11 is going to give me 0.09. On the next one, 2 out of 11. This thing gives me 0.18. Except I'm rounding to 2 decimal places. On the next one, 4 out of 11 gives me 0.36. And then here, 1 out of 11, I get 0.09. 1 out of 11 here as well, 0.09. And lastly, 1 out of 11 is 0.09. Okay, now cumulative relative frequency. My first one is going to be 0.09. Good. Because so far, I'm going down on my list. So far, 0.09. For my next one, add it to this value. 0.09 plus 0 is still 0.09. For the next one, add it to this value. 0.09 plus 0.09 is 0.18. Okay. Now add it to this value. 0.18 plus 0.18 gives me 0.36. Okay. Add it to this value. 0.36 plus 0.36 gives me 0.72. For my next answer, add it to 0.09, so I get 0.81. Add it to this. 0.81 plus 0.09 gives me 0.90. Now, is it okay if I just write 0.9 or 0.90? It's the same thing, right? I'm just going to write it as 0.9, but feel free to write it as 0.90 if that's what you wish. Okay, now 0.9 plus 0.09, I'm going to call this 0.99. Well, got pretty close to 1. So sounds about right. Now, on your homework, kind of like I did it on the previous unit, for my spaces here, I'm going to call them like letters, A, B, C, D, E. I'm going to give a name to each squared, and then I'm going to ask you to fill up each squared individually. You're going to see that. That's what we did before. So you should be okay with this.